The council chamber floated in the darkness of space, a massive ring of metal and glass that orbited the peaceful world of Verath Prime. Inside the main hall, representatives from 40 different species sat in their designated seats, discussing trade agreements and border disputes with the usual diplomatic patience that had kept the galaxy stable for 3,000 years. Ambassador Kelvin Morris sat in the human section, listening to a debate about mineral rights in the outer territories when the emergency alert cut through every speaker in the room. The holographic display at the center of the chamber flickered and changed, showing the face of a Peloran administrator. The Pelorans were a delicate species, their bodies thin and graceful, evolved on a world where gravity was barely a whisper, and natural disasters were almost unknown. The administrator's large eyes were wide with fear, and her voice trembled as she spoke. Her world, Terrace 4, was facing destruction. A massive swarm of asteroids, thousands of them, had been knocked loose by a stellar event at the edge of their system. The rocks were coming straight toward their planet, and the Pelorans had neither the technology nor the physical strength to stop them. 14 days, she said. They had 14 days before the first impacts would begin, and within a week after that, their entire civilization would be wiped from existence. 80 million people lived on Terrace 4. All of them would die unless someone helped. The council chamber erupted into concerned murmurs. Chairman Vexlar, a tall Zentari with gray skin and careful eyes, called for order. His species was known for their methodical approach to problems, and he began laying out the standard emergency protocols with practiced efficiency. First, they would form an emergency committee to assess the situation. Second, they would allocate emergency funds from the council treasury. Third, they would organize a relief convoy to evacuate as many Pelorans as possible. He brought up charts and numbers, showing that with 6 medium-sized transport ships, they could potentially save 30 to 40% of the population if they left within 2 days and maintained maximum speed. The council members nodded thoughtfully, some taking notes, others already calculating how many refugees their own worlds could accept. Kelvin felt his jaw tighten as he listened. 40%. They were calmly discussing acceptable losses, talking about which millions of people would live and which would die, as if this was just another logistics problem to solve, with careful planning and reasonable resource allocation. He had been humanity's ambassador for 3 years now, and he still couldn't get used to how the other species approached emergencies. They were kind, certainly, and they genuinely wanted to help, but they always seemed to move so slowly, so cautiously, calculating costs and benefits before committing to action. Chairman Vexlar turned his attention to the human section. His expression was sympathetic, but practical. He explained that humanity was known for having excellent transport ships, fast and reliable. If Earth could contribute 2 supply vessels to the relief effort, it would increase the survival rate by perhaps 5%. Every ship would make a difference, he said, and the Council would be grateful for any assistance humanity could provide. The other ambassadors looked at Kelvin expectantly, waiting for him to consult with his government, to request time to debate the matter, to negotiate the terms of Earth's contribution. Kelvin stood up, his posture straight and his voice clear. He didn't need to consult with anyone. He already knew what his people would do, what they always did when someone asked for help. He looked Chairman Vexlar directly in the eyes and said 3 simple words: "We'll handle it." The chairman seemed satisfied with this response. Nodding his approval, several other council members murmured their appreciation for Earth's willingness to provide 2 ships. They moved on to other matters, discussing which worlds would accept refugees, how to coordinate the evacuation, what supplies would be needed for the survivors. Kelvin sat back down and immediately activated his secure communication link. The holographic interface appeared in front of him, invisible to the other council members. He sent an urgent message directly to Admiral Patricia Hayes, the commander of the 3rd Human Defense Fleet. The message was brief and direct, containing all the essential information about the Peloran crisis. He marked it with the highest priority code, the one reserved for situations where lives were at stake and time was running out. Then he sat back and waited, listening to the council debate evacuation procedures with maddening slowness. Admiral Hayes responded within 20 minutes. Kelvin read her message and felt a grim smile cross his face. The Admiral had already begun mobilizing her fleet. She was pulling ships from 3 different sectors, requisitioning additional vessels from the mining corps, and coordinating with Earth's logistics command to load emergency supplies. She asked only one question, which Kelvin had expected. Did the council understand what they were about to see? Kelvin replied that they did not, but they would learn soon enough. The council session continued for another 2 hours. They formed their committee, allocated their funds, and scheduled the departure of their 6-ship relief convoy for 48 hours from now. Chairman Vexlar praised the council for their swift response to the crisis, noting that this was one of the fastest emergency mobilizations in recent history. Several ambassadors congratulated each other on their efficiency and compassion. Kelvin said nothing, simply gathering his materials and preparing to leave. As the session ended, a Zentari liaison officer approached him with a datapad. The officer, whose name was Quen, worked as a coordinator between the Council and various military fleets. He informed Kelvin that Earth's 2 supply ships should report to the staging area in the Verath system within 36 hours. They would join the main convoy and follow standard evacuation protocols. Kelvin thanked him politely but didn't correct his assumption. Let them think humanity was sending 2 ships. They would understand the truth soon enough. Kelvin returned to the human embassy section of the station, where his small staff was already monitoring news feeds from Earth. Commander Lisa Grant, his military attaché, showed him the deployment orders that were now spreading through the human fleet network. The numbers made even Kelvin pause for a moment. Admiral Hayes wasn't sending 2 ships or even 20. She was sending everything. Every available vessel in the 3rd Fleet was being mobilized, along with reinforcements from the 7th. Battle cruisers, destroyers, carriers, hospital ships, mining vessels, construction ships, supply haulers, more than 70 ships in total, carrying enough firepower to crack a planet and enough supplies to rebuild one. Commander Grant looked at Kelvin with a mixture of pride and concern. She asked if he thought the Council would object to such a large deployment. Kelvin shook his head. The Council had asked for help, and humanity was providing it. How they chose to help was their own business. Besides, by the time the Council realized what was happening, the human fleet would already be halfway to Terrace 4. Grant nodded and returned to her work, coordinating with the fleet logistics teams. Kelvin stood at the window of his office, looking out at the peaceful stars. Somewhere out there, 80 million Pelorans were watching their sky with growing terror, counting down the days until their world ended. They had asked the galaxy for help, and the galaxy had offered them a 40% chance of survival. But humanity didn't think in terms of acceptable losses. When someone asked for help, you gave them everything you had. You didn't calculate costs or debate efficiency. You acted with overwhelming force and absolute commitment, because that was the only way to guarantee success. It was a lesson Earth had learned through millions of years of surviving on a world that constantly tried to kill them. Half measures didn't work. You either committed completely or you failed. There was no middle ground. The Pelorans had called for help. Humanity had answered. Now the galaxy was about to learn what that really meant. The command center at Luna Base was a massive underground facility carved into the moon's ancient rock, its walls lined with displays showing the positions of every human ship in known space. Admiral Patricia Hayes stood before the largest screen, her gray hair pulled back in a tight bun, her uniform crisp despite the fact that she had been awake for 18 hours. Next to her, Captain Leonard Shaw studied the holographic projection of the Terrace system, with the focused intensity of a man who had spent 30 years commanding warships in hostile territory. Commander Diana Foster stood on the Admiral's other side, her fingers dancing across a data pad as she coordinated with the various fleet groups already responding to the mobilization order. The Peloran crisis had hit Hayes's desk 20 minutes after Ambassador Morris sent his message, and she had wasted no time in issuing orders. The Third Fleet, which normally patrolled the human territories along the galactic rim, was her primary command. 47 ships of various classes, from massive battlecruisers to nimble destroyers, all crewed by men and women who knew their jobs and trusted their commander. Hayes had sent the mobilization order to every single one of them, along with the navigation data for Terrace 4. She had also contacted Admiral George Palmer of the 7th Fleet, requesting additional support. Palmer had responded within minutes, offering 23 more ships, including several heavy haulers and mining vessels that the 3rd Fleet lacked. Captain Shaw pointed at the holographic display, his scarred hand tracing the path of the asteroid swarm. The rocks were spread across a wide area, their trajectories slightly different but all converging on Terrace 4. The largest asteroids were massive, some of them 15 kilometers across. Even one of those monsters hitting the planet would cause an extinction event. The smaller rocks, numbered in the thousands, each one capable of destroying cities or triggering massive tsunamis if they hit the oceans. Shaw ran the numbers through the tactical computer and grunted. It was a bad situation, but not impossible. With enough firepower and proper coordination, they could eliminate the threat entirely. Hayes nodded and turned to Foster. The commander had already begun working on the fleet organization, dividing the ships into task groups based on their capabilities. Battlecruisers would handle the largest asteroids with their main guns. Destroyers would provide point defense and tackle medium-sized rocks. The carriers would deploy fighter squadrons to intercept the smaller fragments. Mining vessels would attach industrial explosives to any asteroids too large to destroy outright. Hospital ships would stand by in case of accidents, though Hayes intended for there to be none. Supply haulers would carry everything from ammunition to replacement parts to food for both the human crews and the Pelleran population, if evacuation became necessary. The Zentari liaison officer assigned to Luna Base, an individual named Quen, entered the command center with his datapad clutched in his thin fingers. He approached Admiral Hayes with visible nervousness, his species not comfortable with the rapid pace of human military operations. He informed the Admiral that the Council was expecting Earth's 2 supply ships to report to the staging area. Hayes glanced at him briefly before returning her attention to the display. She told Quen that Earth wasn't sending 2 ships. Quen's relief was visible as he nodded. Assuming that humanity had decided to send 3 or perhaps 4 vessels instead, he began to thank the Admiral for the additional support when Hayes finished her sentence. 70 ships, she said. The 3rd and elements of the 7th Fleet. Full combat deployment with support vessels. Quen's large eyes went even wider. He stammered that such a deployment was unnecessary for an evacuation operation. His species had calculated that 12 ships would be sufficient to save a significant portion of the population. Hayes turned to face him fully, her expression patient but firm. She explained that humanity wasn't evacuating the Pellerans. They were going to save the planet itself. Every rock in that swarm would be destroyed or deflected before it reached Terrace 4. The Pellerans would keep their world, their cities, their forests, their history, everything. The Zentari officer protested that such an operation was impossible. The timeline was too short, the number of asteroids too large. Even if it could be done, the cost in resources and ship time would be enormous. Why not simply evacuate the population and let the planet go? Hayes looked at him with the expression of someone trying to explain basic mathematics to a child. She said that losing the planet wasn't acceptable. The Pellerans had asked for help, and humanity was going to provide it. Completely. The cost didn't matter. The difficulty didn't matter. What mattered was that 80 million people would not lose their home if humans had the power to prevent it. Captain Shaw added his own perspective with the bluntness of a career military officer. He told Quen that this was how Deathworlders operated. Earth had tried to kill humans for millions of years with earthquakes, volcanoes, hurricanes, tsunamis, droughts, floods, diseases, and predators. Humanity had learned that you don't survive by doing the minimum or accepting losses. You survive by hitting back with everything you have until the threat is eliminated. That same mentality applied to helping others. You either commit fully or you don't bother. There was no middle ground. Commander Foster interrupted with updated deployment schedules. The first wave of ships would depart Luna Base within 6 hours. The full fleet would assemble in high orbit around Earth within 12 hours. From there, they would jump to Terrace 4, using a route that Foster had calculated through the Kepler drift. Quinn immediately objected, explaining that the drift was extremely dangerous. The gravitational anomalies in that region of space made navigation nearly impossible. Most species avoided it entirely. Ships that entered the drift risked being torn apart by tidal forces or thrown off course by unpredictable eddies in space-time. The safe route to Terrace 4 took 12 days. The route through the drift could theoretically cut that to 6 days, but the risk was enormous. Hayes asked Captain Shaw if the Valiant could handle the drift. Shaw's response was immediate and confident. His ship had been built to handle rough conditions. She was a battlecruiser designed and constructed by people who came from a world where the weather could kill you and the ground could open up and swallow cities. A little rough space wouldn't be a problem. Hayes nodded and ordered Shaw to lead the vanguard through the drift. The rest of the fleet would follow in his wake. If any ships encountered difficulties, they would assist each other. That was what fleets did. Quinn filed his report with the Council, detailing the human deployment plans. When Chairman Vex'Lar read the report, he initially assumed there had been a translation error. 70 warships seemed excessive to the point of absurdity. He contacted Quinn directly to confirm the numbers. The Zentari liaison confirmed that yes, humanity was indeed deploying a full battle fleet to handle the Pelleran crisis. They intended to travel through the Kepler drift, arrive 4 days ahead of the Council convoy, and destroy the entire asteroid swarm before it reached the planet. Vex'Lar listened to this explanation with growing disbelief. He asked what humanity hoped to gain from such an expensive and dangerous operation. Quinn replied that as far as he could tell, they wanted nothing except to ensure that the Pellerans survived with their world intact. Back at Luna Base, the fleet assembly was proceeding with impressive efficiency. Ships arrived from their patrol sectors, their crews already briefed on the mission parameters. Supply haulers loaded cargo with the speed that came from years of practice. The UNS Valiant, Shaw's battlecruiser, took position at the head of the forming fleet. The ship was a monster of metal and weapons, her hull scarred from a dozen previous battles, but still solid and reliable. Shaw's crew of 300 worked with the smooth coordination of people who trusted each other completely. Lieutenant Greg Harrison supervised the loading operations at the main supply depot. His teams moved container after container into the waiting haulers, each one filled with essentials: food, water, medical supplies, construction equipment, prefabricated shelters, power generators, communication systems, enough to support the entire Pelleran population for months if necessary. Harrison also ensured that ammunition was loaded in massive quantities. His father had been a Marine, and his grandfather before that. The family motto was simple, but effective: hope for the best but prepare for the worst. If the asteroid destruction went smoothly, they wouldn't need the extra ammunition. If complications arose, they would be grateful for every round. The fleet finished assembling in orbit 30 minutes ahead of schedule. 70 ships hung in formation above Earth, their running lights creating a constellation of human determination. On the surface below, billions of people watched the news feeds with pride. This was what humanity did. When someone asked for help, they responded with overwhelming force and absolute commitment. It didn't matter that the Pellerans were aliens or that Terrace 4 was halfway across the galaxy. What mattered was that people were in danger, and humans had the power to save them. Admiral Hayes broadcast a message to the entire fleet. Her words were simple and direct, the kind of speech that military personnel appreciated. She reminded them that 80 million lives depended on their success. She told them that the galaxy was watching to see what humanity would do. Most importantly, she told them that she had complete confidence in their abilities. They were the best trained, best equipped, and most determined fleet in known space. They would jump through the drift, They would reach Terrace 4, and they would eliminate every threat to that world. Failure was not an option. The fleet acknowledged her orders with crisp efficiency. Captain Shaw sent a final message to Luna Base, confirming that the Valiant was ready to lead the way. Commander Foster verified that all ships had received the navigation data. Lieutenant Harrison confirmed that all supplies were loaded and secured. Every system was green. Every crew was ready. Admiral Hayes gave the order, and the human fleet jumped into hyperspace, heading straight for the Kepler drift and the desperate world beyond it. Behind them, the Zenturi liaison Quen sent an updated report to the Council, though he doubted they would believe what they were about to witness. The Kepler drift looked like a patch of twisted space, where reality itself seemed uncertain. Sensors showed gravitational anomalies scattered throughout the region. Invisible currents that could grab a ship and throw it off course, or crush it entirely if the vessel wasn't strong enough to resist. Most civilized species had mapped the drift centuries ago, and then promptly added it to their list of places to avoid. The safe routes around it added days to journey times, but that was considered preferable to risking ships and crews in its unpredictable embrace. Captain Leonard Shaw stood on the bridge of the UNS Valiant and watched the drift approach on his displays, with the calm expression of a man who had faced worse things than angry space. Shaw had spent 3 decades in the human fleet, working his way up from junior officer to command of one of humanity's most powerful battlecruisers. He had fought pirates in the outer colonies, patrolled borders during tense standoffs, and survived a battle with hostile raiders that had left his previous ship crippled but victorious. The Valiant was his third command, and he knew every rivet and wire in her massive hull. The ship had been built at the Mars yards, specifically for operations in dangerous environments. Her structural supports were reinforced with materials that could flex under stress without breaking. Her hull plating was thicker than standard by a factor of 3. Her engines were powerful enough to pull her out of a gravity well that would trap lighter vessels. She was, in short, exactly the kind of ship you wanted when heading into a region of space that most species considered suicidal to enter. Lieutenant Claire Stevens sat at the navigation console, her hands steady on the controls as she made final adjustments to their course. She had plotted their path through the drift, using every scrap of data humanity had collected about the region, which wasn't much. The drift changed constantly, its gravitational anomalies shifting like weather patterns. Her route was based on probability and educated guesswork, threading between the most dangerous areas while accepting that they would still encounter significant turbulence. Stevens had joined the fleet straight out of university, turning down comfortable civilian positions to serve on warships. Her parents had thought she was crazy. She had tried to explain that comfortable wasn't what she wanted. She wanted to be part of something that mattered. Ensign Paul Garrett monitored the structural integrity systems, his young face showing concentration but not fear. This was his first major deployment since graduating from the academy, and he was determined to prove himself. The Valiant's structural monitors showed green across the board, all systems nominal. Garrett had studied the ship's specifications until he could recite them from memory. He knew her tolerances, her stress limits, her backup systems. When the drift started to shake them, he would know immediately if anything went wrong. Shaw gave the order to enter the drift, and the Valiant pushed forward into the maelstrom. The ship began to shudder almost immediately as the first gravitational eddies caught her. Alarms blinked on multiple consoles, warning of stress on the hull and fluctuations in the artificial gravity. Stevens adjusted their course constantly, her fingers dancing across the controls as she tried to find the smoothest path through the chaos. The ship groaned, a deep metallic sound that vibrated through the deck plates. Garrett's monitors showed yellow warnings in 3 sections, but nothing critical yet. The Valiant was doing what she had been built to do, taking punishment that would have torn apart softer ships. Behind the Valiant, 5 destroyers followed in tight formation. These smaller ships had an easier time in some ways, their size allowing them to slip between gravitational currents that battered the larger battlecruiser. Their captains maintained constant communication with Shaw, reporting their status and adjusting their positions to stay in the Valiant's wake. Further back, the main body of the fleet entered the drift in organized waves. Admiral Hayes watched from the bridge of the carrier UNS Endeavour as her ships reported in one by one. Each vessel shook and flexed as the drift grabbed at them, but they were all built to handle rough conditions. This was merely unpleasant, not impossible. Commander Diana Foster stood beside the Admiral, monitoring the fleet status displays with practiced efficiency. Every ship showed green or yellow status markers. No red, no emergencies, no vessels in serious danger. The human ships pushed through the drift like icebreakers through frozen seas, forcing their way forward through sheer toughness and determination. Foster had served with Hayes for 8 years and had learned to trust the Admiral's instincts completely. When Hayes had decided to take the fleet through the drift, Foster had run the numbers and concluded that it was risky but feasible. Now those calculations were being proven correct in real time. The journey through the drift took 18 hours of constant vigilance. Crews worked in shifts, but nobody truly rested. Even off-duty personnel found themselves lying in their bunks, listening to the groans and shudders of their ships, counting the stress alerts, trusting that their vessels would hold together. Coffee consumption across the fleet reached levels that would have hospitalized most alien species. But human crews had long ago adapted to running on caffeine and determination. Shaw himself spent 16 of the 18 hours on the bridge, leaving only twice for brief trips to the bathroom. Stevens never left her post at all, sustained by coffee that Garrett brought her at regular intervals. The worst moment came 14 hours into the transit, when the Valiant encountered a gravitational eddy that hadn't appeared on any of their scans. The ship lurched violently to starboard, her hull screaming in protest as forces tried to pull her in 2 different directions simultaneously. Shaw grabbed his command chair to keep from being thrown across the bridge. Stevens fought with the controls, firing maneuvering thrusters at full power to counter the pull. Garrett watched his monitors flash red in a dozen locations, structural stress approaching critical levels in the ship's midsection. For 30 seconds, the Valiant hung in the balance, caught between gravitational forces that would have crushed a civilian vessel like an empty can. Then Stevens found their escape vector, a narrow path between the conflicting forces. She pushed the Valiant through with engines straining, the ship's powerful drives barely enough to overcome the gravitational grip. The battlecruiser tore free of the eddy and surged forward, her hull groaning but intact. Garrett's monitors slowly shifted from red back to yellow as the stress decreased. Shaw let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding and asked for a damage report. The ship had suffered minor stress fractures in 3 bulkheads, nothing that couldn't be repaired by the onboard maintenance crews. Stevens reported that the worst of the drift was behind them now. The remaining passage should be rough, but manageable. Behind the Valiant, the rest of the fleet had watched their flagship nearly get torn apart. Every captain adjusted their course slightly to avoid the same eddy, using the Valiant's experience to plot safer paths. Only one ship suffered significant damage during the entire transit. The supply hauler, UNS Abundance, caught the edge of another gravitational anomaly and had her forward sensor array ripped clean off the hull. The ship's crew reported the damage immediately, but assured command that it wasn't serious. They could navigate using backup sensors, and the array could be replaced once they reached Terrace 4. The chief engineer volunteered to go outside and patch the mounting point during the last few hours of the transit, just to keep his crews busy and prevent them from worrying. Hayes received status reports from every ship as they emerged from the drift. 70 vessels had entered that dangerous region of space. 70 vessels came out the other side, battered but functional. No casualties, no lost ships, no crews requesting to turn back. The Admiral felt a surge of pride in her people. This was what separated humanity from many other species. They didn't avoid danger when it stood between them and their objective. They calculated the risks, prepared as best they could, and then pushed through with determination and skill. The drift had been dangerous, certainly, but the alternative was arriving too late to save Terrace 4. That wasn't acceptable, so they had done what was necessary. Captain Shaw finally left his bridge to grab food and a quick nap once the Valiant cleared the drift. Stevens remained at her post, though Garrett convinced her to at least drink some water and eat a protein bar. Around the fleet, crews began to relax slightly, knowing that the worst part of the journey was behind them. Maintenance teams went to work, repairing the minor damage that nearly every ship had sustained. Engineers checked and rechecked systems, making sure nothing had been weakened to the point of failure. Medical staff treated the handful of crew members who had been bruised or sprained something during the violent maneuvers through the drift. 4 days ahead of schedule, and 6 days from Terrace 4, the human fleet continued its journey at maximum sustainable speed. Long-range sensors began to pick up the asteroid swarm, exactly where the Peleron data had predicted it would be. The rocks filled the sensor displays like a cloud of death. Thousands of individual threats, all converging on a single point. Shaw returned to his bridge after a 3-hour nap and studied the sensor data with a tactical officer's eye. It was a big job, but not impossible. With proper coordination and enough firepower, they could eliminate every rock large enough to cause surface damage. It would take time and ammunition, but that was why they had brought plenty of both. Admiral Hayes sent a message ahead to Terrace 4, informing them that the human fleet had arrived and would begin defensive operations immediately upon reaching effective weapons range. On the planet below, Administrator Cyrell received the message with shock and disbelief. The Council convoy wasn't supposed to arrive for another 6 days. How had the humans gotten here so fast? Her sensor operators provided the impossible answer. The human fleet had come through the Kepler drift, a route that Peleron ships could never survive. 70 warships had braved a region of space that most species considered impassable, cutting days off their journey time, arriving early to ensure they had maximum time to work. Cyrell broadcast the news across her world. The humans were here. The impossible had happened. Hope, which had been dying with each passing day, suddenly blazed bright again. The Pelerons watched their orbital sensors with growing wonder as the human fleet spread across their system in a complex defensive formation. They had asked the galaxy for help, and the galaxy had sent them Deathworlders, warriors from a harsh world who looked at their impossible crisis and saw merely a difficult problem that could be solved with enough determination and firepower. Shaw positioned the Valiant at the point of maximum asteroid concentration, where the largest rocks would arrive first. Around him, the rest of the fleet took up their assigned positions, creating a defensive grid that covered every approach to Terrace 4. Destroyers spread out in a wide net, their point defense systems ready. Carriers launched their fighter squadrons, hundreds of small craft taking position like a swarm of protective insects. Mining vessels moved to intercept the largest asteroids, their crews preparing industrial explosives and drilling equipment. Hospital ships positioned themselves in safe orbits, ready to receive any casualties, though everyone hoped there would be none. Admiral Hayes looked at her tactical display and felt satisfied with the deployment. Every ship was where it needed to be. Every crew knew their job. Every weapon system was armed and ready. She opened a fleet-wide channel and gave a simple order. All ships were weapons-free. They would engage targets as they entered effective range and would continue operations until the threat was completely eliminated. The human fleet acknowledged her orders and settled in to wait for the asteroids to arrive. The first asteroids entered weapons range just after dawn on Terrace 4, though the Pelerans watching from the surface couldn't see the beginning of the battle. The rocks were still too far away, visible only to the powerful sensors of the orbital stations and the human warships. But the Pelorans could see the flashes of light that began to appear in their night sky, brief sparks that marked the destruction of chunks of stone that had threatened to end their civilization. Each flash represented tons of rock vaporized by human weapons, threats eliminated before they could come close to the atmosphere. The Pelerans had never seen anything like it. Their own limited defense systems could barely track the incoming swarm, let alone stop it. The humans made it look almost routine. Commander Diana Foster sat in the command center of the UNS Endeavour and directed fighter operations with the efficiency of someone who had done this 1,000 times before. Her screens showed hundreds of small craft spread across the battle space, each one piloted by a human who had trained for years to do exactly this job. The fighters worked in coordinated teams, approaching asteroids from multiple angles to maximize their effectiveness. Each fighter carried missiles with shaped charges designed to fracture rock, along with kinetic weapons that could punch through stone like it was paper. Foster assigned targets based on size and trajectory, making sure that no asteroid went unengaged and no fighter group was overwhelmed. Lieutenant Rachel Monroe led a squadron of 12 fighters in the outer defensive zone, intercepting asteroids before they could get close to the main fleet. Her fighter was a sleek machine built for speed and firepower, cramped inside but deadly effective. Monroe had joined the fleet because her father had served, and his father before him, a family tradition that went back to the early days of human spaceflight. She loved the freedom of flying, the way a fighter responded to her commands, like an extension of her own body. Right now, her sensors showed an asteroid the size of a house tumbling toward them at several kilometers per second. She designated it as Target Alpha and signaled her squadron to attack. The 12 fighters converged on the asteroid from different vectors, their computers coordinating the assault to ensure maximum effect. Monroe fired first, her missiles streaking across the gap and slamming into the rock with precise timing. The shaped charges detonated in sequence, each explosion driving cracks deeper into the asteroid's structure. Her wingman followed up with kinetic rounds, the high-velocity projectiles hitting the weakened points and shattering the rock into dozens of smaller fragments. The rest of the squadron mopped up, destroying the fragments before they could pose any threat. The entire engagement took less than 2 minutes from target acquisition to complete destruction. Captain Vincent Hayes, no relation to the Admiral despite sharing a last name, commanded a squadron working closer to the planet. His targets were the medium-sized asteroids that had made it through the outer defenses, rocks that were too small for the battlecruisers to waste ammunition on, but too large for the point defense systems to handle effectively. Hayes had been flying combat missions for 15 years and had the kind of instinctive understanding of three-dimensional combat that only came from experience. He spotted an asteroid on a particularly dangerous trajectory, one that would hit Terrace 4's largest ocean and trigger massive tsunamis if it wasn't stopped. He designated it Priority 1 and took his squadron in fast. The asteroid was irregular and tumbling, making it a difficult target. Hayes matched its rotation and fired a spread of missiles that hit simultaneously along its longest axis. The rock split into 3 large pieces, each still dangerous, but now on slightly different trajectories. Hayes coordinated with his squadron to take 1 piece each, destroying them with combined fire before they could threaten the planet. His computer logged the kill and immediately assigned him a new target. There was no time to celebrate or rest. The asteroids kept coming, and the fighters kept destroying them. Back with the main fleet, Captain Leonard Shaw commanded the Valiant against the largest threats. His sensors had identified an asteroid that his crew had nicknamed Mountain, a massive chunk of rock, 15 kilometers across, that was the single most dangerous object in the entire swarm. If Mountain hit Terrace 4, it would punch through the crust and trigger volcanic eruptions that would darken the sky for years. Everything on the planet would die, not from the initial impact but from the slow starvation that followed. Shaw had no intention of letting that happen. He positioned the Valiant directly in Mountain's path and prepared to demonstrate why battlecruisers were called the heavy artillery of space warfare. The Valiant's main guns were enormous weapons that ran the length of the ship, capable of accelerating projectiles to a significant fraction of light speed. Each shot required enough energy to power a small city, and the recoil was enough to shake the entire vessel despite her massive size. Shaw gave the order to fire, and the Valiant's main batteries spoke with the voice of human engineering. Railgun slugs, each one a solid rod of dense metal, crossed the distance to Mountain at speeds that made them effectively unstoppable. They hit with kinetic energy that exceeded some nuclear weapons, punching deep into the asteroid and creating shock waves that radiated through the entire structure. Mountain shuddered but didn't break. The rock was too large, too solid, too stubborn to give up easily. Shaw ordered a second volley, then a third. Each salvo drove cracks deeper into the asteroid's heart, weakening it but not quite achieving the catastrophic failure he needed. Meanwhile, mining vessels moved in close, their crews preparing to finish what the Valiant had started. These were civilian ships, with military retrofits, crewed by men and women who normally spent their time breaking up asteroids for valuable minerals. Today they were breaking up an asteroid to save a planet, but the basic job was the same. Lieutenant Greg Harrison coordinated the mining teams with the calm competence of someone who had supervised dangerous industrial operations for most of his adult life. His people moved their ships right up against mountains' tumbling surface, close enough that one mistake would mean getting crushed by millions of tons of spinning rock. They attached industrial-grade explosive charges to key structural points identified by the Valiant's scans. Harrison worked with a team of civilian contractors who had volunteered for hazard pay and the chance to be part of something historic. These people placed explosives in hard vacuum on a tumbling asteroid like it was just another day at the office, because to them, it basically was. The only difference was the scale and the stakes. Once all charges were placed, the mining vessels retreated to a safe distance. Harrison verified that everyone was clear, then sent the detonation signal. The charges went off in a precisely timed sequence, designed to propagate cracks through the asteroid's entire structure. Mountain came apart in a spectacular display of force, breaking into 7 large fragments and hundreds of smaller pieces. Each major fragment was immediately engaged by waiting destroyers, their point defense systems and secondary weapons, breaking the fragments down into even smaller pieces. Shaw watched with satisfaction as the threat that could have ended a civilization was reduced to rubble that would burn up in the atmosphere as shooting stars. The battle continued for 48 hours without pause. Crews worked in shifts, grabbing sleep and food when they could, then returning to their stations to continue the endless cycle of target acquisition and destruction. Coffee became the unofficial fuel of the fleet, consumed in quantities that would have seemed absurd if the job hadn't required such constant alertness. Ships reported ammunition expenditures in real time, and supply haulers moved between vessels to replenish depleted magazines. The entire operation ran with the smooth efficiency of a well-rehearsed drill. Except the targets were real, and the consequences of failure were measured in millions of lives. Lieutenant Claire Stevens, who had navigated the Valiant through the Kepler drift, found herself assigned to coordinate with other ships to optimize firing solutions. She worked with barely any sleep, sustained by determination and the knowledge that her calculations were saving lives. When Captain Shaw suggested she take a break, she politely declined. There would be time to rest when the job was done. Right now, people were depending on her to do her job perfectly, and that was exactly what she intended to do. Shaw understood completely. He felt the same way, as did most of the crews throughout the fleet. On Terrace 4, the Pelorans watched the sky transform into a light show. The flashes grew more frequent as the asteroid swarm reached its peak density. Some Pelorans were frightened by the display, not understanding that each flash meant another threat eliminated. Administrator Cyril broadcast regular updates, explaining that the humans were winning. Every asteroid that the sensors tracked was being engaged and destroyed. The initial predictions had showed thousands of impacts over the course of a week. The current predictions showed 0 impacts because the humans weren't allowing any rocks to get through their defensive grid. Cyril opened a communication channel to Admiral Hayes and asked a question that had been bothering her. How many ships would humanity normally send for an operation like this? Hayes' response was immediate and matter-of-fact. All of them, she said. When someone asks humanity for help, we don't send tokens or minimum forces. We send everything necessary to guarantee success. The cost doesn't matter. The difficulty doesn't matter. What matters is that the job gets done completely. Cyril thanked her and closed the channel, though she wasn't sure the Admiral understood how profound that answer was. The Pelorans had asked for help, and humanity had responded as if Terrace 4 was Earth itself, defending it with the same absolute commitment they would show to their own homeworld. By the end of the second day, the asteroid swarm had been reduced to scattered fragments. The fighters continued patrol operations, hunting down the last few rocks that might pose any danger. The larger ships stood down from combat alert, but remained at their stations, weapons ready in case any threat had been missed. Crews began the tedious work of post-battle inspections and repairs. Ammunition was replenished, damaged systems were fixed, and comprehensive reports were filed. Every ship had fired thousands of rounds. Every crew was exhausted. But the job was done. Captain Shaw stood on the bridge of the Valiant and looked at the tactical display, showing Terrace 4, peaceful and intact, in the center of the screen. Around the planet, a cloud of debris marked where the asteroid swarm had been. Most of that debris would eventually fall into the sun or drift out of the system entirely. None of it would threaten the planet. The mission was a complete success by any measure. No asteroids had reached the surface. No cities were destroyed. No Pelerons had died. The only casualties were some depleted ammunition stores and a lot of tired human crews who would sleep well knowing they had done their job perfectly. Commander Foster compiled the final operational report for Admiral Hayes. 0 civilian casualties. 0 lost human vessels. Approximately 4,000 asteroids destroyed or deflected. Mission duration 48 hours. Ammunition expenditure within acceptable parameters. All ships reporting green status, with only minor damage requiring repair. It was, Foster noted in her summary, a textbook operation executed with precision and overwhelming force. The kind of operation that would be studied in military academies as an example of how to conduct defensive actions in space. Hayes read the report and nodded with satisfaction. She sent a message to all ships, commending them for their professional performance and announcing that they would remain in the Terrace system for another 72 hours to ensure no threats had been missed. After that, they would return to their normal patrol sectors. The crews acknowledged her message and began to truly relax for the first time since entering the Kepler drift. They had come here to do a job, and they had done it well. Now, they could take a breath before moving on to whatever came next. The third day after the last asteroid was destroyed, a diplomatic vessel bearing the insignia of the Galactic Council arrived in the Terrace system. Chairman Vexlar had come personally to assess the situation and coordinate the relief efforts that the Council had been planning. His ship emerged from hyperspace expecting to find a disaster zone, refugee camps, and the grim work of sorting through casualties. Instead, his sensors showed him something that didn't make sense, according to any model his species had developed for crisis management. Terrace 4 was intact, her cities undamaged, her forests still standing, her oceans calm. The only sign that anything had happened was the unusually large amount of debris floating in the outer system and the presence of 70 human warships in defensive positions around the planet. Vexlar requested permission to dock with the UNS Endeavour, and Admiral Patricia Hayes granted it immediately. The chairman brought a small staff with him, all of them showing the same confusion he felt. They were escorted to a conference room where Hayes waited along with Captain Leonard Shaw and Commander Diana Foster. The Admiral offered refreshments, which the Zentari delegation politely declined. Vexlar wanted answers before anything else. His carefully prepared speech about managing the evacuation and providing relief to survivors died on his lips when Hayes calmly informed him that there had been no evacuation and no casualties. Every asteroid in the swarm had been eliminated or deflected. Terrace 4 was safe. The chairman sat in silence for a long moment, processing this information. His species thought in terms of logistics and resource management, calculating optimal outcomes based on available assets. The Peleron crisis had presented a clear equation in his mind. Limited time plus massive threat equaled unavoidable losses. The best outcome would have been saving 40% of the population through evacuation. A good outcome would have been saving 30%. The humans had somehow achieved a 100% survival rate while also preserving the planet itself. The equation didn't balance according to any model he understood. Vexlar asked the question that had been growing in his mind since receiving the initial reports. Why had humanity sent 70 warships to handle what was essentially a natural disaster response? The Council's plan had called for 6 transport ships, a reasonable allocation given the usual constraints of emergency relief operations. Hayes looked at him with the patient expression of someone explaining something obvious to a child. She told him that 40% survival wasn't acceptable to humanity. The Pelerans had asked for help, and humans didn't respond to requests for help by calculating acceptable losses. They responded by eliminating losses entirely. 6 ships might have saved some people, but 70 ships guaranteed saving everyone. Captain Shaw added his perspective with the bluntness that came from 3 decades of military service. He explained that this was fundamental to how Deathworlders approached problems. Earth had tried to kill humanity for millions of years through every natural disaster imaginable. Humans had learned that survival required absolute commitment, that half measures led to failure, that you either used everything you had or you lost. That mentality applied to everything they did, including helping others. When you asked a human for help, you got everything they could possibly give, because anything less felt like abandoning the people who had trusted them. Vexlar struggled to understand the economics of such an approach. He asked about the cost of deploying so many ships, the ammunition expended, the risk to human crews traveling through the Kepler drift. Hayes acknowledged that yes, the operation had been expensive by conventional accounting. The ammunition alone represented a significant fraction of the Third Fleet's annual allocation. The wear and tear on the ships would require extensive maintenance. The hazard pay for crews who had gone through the drift would add up. But she said all of this without any hint of regret or concern. The cost was irrelevant compared to the outcome. 80 million people were alive who would have died. That was the only number that truly mattered. Commander Foster provided the chairman with detailed operational reports showing exactly how the defense had been conducted, the tactical coordination, the weapons expenditure, the crew schedules. All of it documented with military precision. Vexlar read through the reports with growing amazement. The humans had treated the asteroid swarm like an enemy fleet, applying military doctrine and overwhelming firepower to a problem that most species would have approached as an unavoidable natural catastrophe. They had turned a disaster into a target and then systematically destroyed it. The efficiency was remarkable, but the mindset behind it was what truly astonished him. Down on Terrace 4, Administrator Cyril was organizing a planet-wide celebration. The Pelerons were not a warlike species and had never witnessed military power on the scale the humans had demonstrated. But they understood gratitude. Every city on the planet was preparing ceremonies to honor the humans who had saved them. Cyril herself wanted to meet with Admiral Hayes personally to express her people's thanks. She sent a formal invitation, and Hayes accepted, though the Admiral warned that she wasn't comfortable with elaborate ceremonies. Cyril assured her that the Pelerans simply wanted to say thank you to the people who had given them a future. Hayes took a shuttle down to the planet's surface, bringing Captain Shaw and a small honor guard with her. They landed in the capital city, where thousands of Pelorans had gathered, despite their natural shyness around strangers. The crowd was quiet, but their emotions were obvious. Many of them held drawings made by their children, pictures of human ships surrounded by stars, and hopeful messages written in careful Peleron script. Hayes felt something catch in her throat as she looked at those drawings. Seeing herself and her crews depicted as heroes by people who had never expected to survive. Cyril greeted the humans with the formal grace of her species but couldn't entirely hide her emotions. She told Hayes that her people had been counting down the days to their extinction, watching their sky with growing dread. They had called for help hoping that someone might save a fraction of their population. Instead, humanity had arrived early, fought for 2 days without rest, and saved everyone. She asked Hayes why humans had done this. Why they had risked so much and spent so much for aliens they had never met. Hayes gave the same answer she had given the chairman. Because you asked for help, and we had the power to give it. That was enough. The Peleron celebration lasted for hours, and Hayes endured it with as much grace as she could manage. She wasn't comfortable being treated as a hero for doing her job, but she understood that the Pelerans needed this. They needed to express their gratitude, to mark the moment when their world had been saved. Shaw stood beside her throughout the ceremony, equally uncomfortable with the attention but accepting it as part of their duty. When a Peleran child approached them with a drawing of the Valiant, Shaw knelt down to accept it personally, his scarred face softening as he looked at the careful artwork. Lieutenant Rachel Monroe, who had led fighter squadrons through the battle, found herself surrounded by young Pelerons who wanted to hear about flying in space. She described the freedom of piloting a fighter, the way it responded to her commands, the satisfaction of protecting people who couldn't protect themselves. The children listened with wide eyes, and Monroe realized that she was probably inspiring some of them to become pilots themselves someday. The thought made her smile. Maybe in a generation or two, Terrace 4 would have its own defense force, trained by humans who remembered when they had needed saving. Back in orbit, Chairman Vexlar was composing his report to the Galactic Council. He knew that many members would struggle to believe what had happened here. The Zentari were not an emotional species, preferring logic and careful analysis to dramatic gestures. But Vexlar found himself writing with unusual passion about what he had witnessed. Humanity had demonstrated something that the Council had forgotten over millennia of peaceful civilization. When faced with a crisis, overwhelming commitment produced better results than careful resource management. The humans hadn't calculated acceptable losses because they refused to accept any losses at all. It was expensive, certainly, and emotionally exhausting for everyone involved. It was also remarkably effective. The chairman recommended that the Council study human crisis response protocols, with an eye toward adapting them for other species. Obviously, not every race had access to ships tough enough to survive the Kepler drift or weapons powerful enough to destroy thousands of asteroids. But the mindset could be adopted. Instead of asking what minimum resources would produce acceptable outcomes, they should ask what maximum resources would guarantee complete success. The shift in thinking seemed simple, but Vexlar suspected it would be revolutionary in practice. The Council operated on principles that were thousands of years old, principles that had kept the galaxy stable but perhaps too conservative. Admiral Hayes returned to the Endeavour after the ceremony and immediately checked on fleet status. Most ships had completed their post-battle maintenance and were ready to depart. A few vessels still had minor repairs ongoing, but nothing that couldn't be finished en route to their next assignments. Hayes gave the order to begin the withdrawal, and the human fleet started breaking orbit in organized waves. They would return through normal space this time. No need to risk the Kepler drift now that speed wasn't critical. The journey home would take longer, but give crews time to rest and recover. Ambassador Kelvin Morris, watching events unfold from the Council station, received messages from dozens of species asking about humanity's response to the Peloran crisis. Many seemed shocked by the scale of the deployment. Some were concerned about the implications of humanity having that much military power available. A few were inspired and wanted to know if humans would respond the same way if their worlds faced disasters. Kelvin answered each message carefully, explaining that yes, this was how humanity operated. When someone asked for help, they got everything humans could give. It wasn't about politics or alliances or trade agreements. It was simply about having the power to save lives and choosing to use it. Lieutenant Greg Harrison supervised the unloading of supplies that hadn't been needed, the emergency rations and construction equipment and medical supplies that had been brought just in case. He arranged for most of it to be donated to Terrace 4 anyway, figuring that having extra supplies never hurt anyone. The Pelorans accepted gratefully, still somewhat stunned by the generosity they were experiencing. Harrison's teams worked efficiently, knowing that every hour spent here was an hour they could be needed somewhere else. This job was done, complete and successful, but there would be other crises and other people who needed help. Captain Shaw sat in his quarters aboard the Valiant, looking at the drawing the Peloran child had given him. The ship was rendered in simple lines, surrounded by stars and protective circles. The child had written "Thank you" in both Peloran and carefully copied English letters. Shaw carefully stored the drawing in his personal locker, where it would travel with him to the next assignment and the one after that. It would remind him why he did this job, why he spent years of his life on warships dealing with danger and discomfort. Because sometimes, someone needed help, and he had the power to provide it. The human fleet departed the Taurus system 3 days after the last asteroid was destroyed, leaving behind an intact world and a grateful population. The Pelorans would remember this forever, the day when Deathworlders from a harsh world came to their rescue and saved everything they held dear. The story would be passed down through generations, probably growing more dramatic with each telling, but the core would remain true. Humanity had been asked for help, and humanity had responded with everything they had. In the weeks that followed, the effects of the Terrace 4 operation rippled through the Galactic Council. Several species quietly approached human representatives about establishing mutual defense agreements. Others began upgrading their own emergency response capabilities, inspired by what they had witnessed. The Council itself started revising its protocols for crisis management. Though Vexlar knew it would take years to overcome thousands of years of cautious tradition. But the seed had been planted. The galaxy had seen what was possible when you committed completely to helping others. Admiral Hayes submitted her final report and moved on to other duties. She didn't think of the Terrace 4 operation as particularly special. Just another successful mission in a long career of service. Her crews felt the same way, proud of their work but ready for whatever came next. Lieutenant Claire Stevens went back to navigation duties. Lieutenant Rachel Monroe returned to training flights. Captain Leonard Shaw took the Valiant on patrol in the outer sectors. They were Deathworlders. And this was what Deathworlders did. They faced impossible situations and made them possible through determination and overwhelming force. They didn't do small aid, or acceptable losses, or half measures. When someone asked for help, they gave everything. Every single time. That was the human way. And they wouldn't have it any other way.